The fuck did you just say? Why are fewer people having children? Iain Dale is asking, why are fewer people having children? Just so we're clear, Iain Dale, obviously Brexit supporting boomer. The people he's talking about, people of child rearing age, millennials and Gen Z. Us. And remember, the primary reason why people are not having kids as much these days is because we simply cannot afford it. But Iain Dale is one of the reasons why we can't afford to have kids, because he, as a host of LBC for the last 10 or so years, backed Brexit, which has taken £1,000 from the average household every single year. And Brexit is making everything more expensive, including food, hell, even baby formula. So for Brexit backing boomer Iain Dale to be complaining that a generation that voted against Brexit isn't having that many kids is like shitting in my mouth and then complaining that my breath stinks. And this shit is personal for me, not just because I probably would have liked to have had kids if not for having to fight Brexit and not having the money, but because I personally took Iain Dale on back in the day, and I'm going to need you to lock in for this. Because the reason why Brexit is making things more expensive is because if you leave the EU and no longer follow the same rules as EU countries follows when it comes to product rules and regulations, that means that products sold in the UK are no longer automatically legal to sell in the EU and vice versa. And that creates extra paperwork, which adds extra costs, and that raises your prices in the supermarkets. Now, the system that the EU has that covers those rules is called the single market. Now, Norway, which is a country that isn't inside the EU, follows the rules of the EU single market despite not being inside the EU. Which means there was a way to do Brexit without damaging the economy, but hard Brexiteers did not want any of that because that would have meant following the rules of the EU, but no longer having a say in shaping those rules because we'd no longer be a member. And one of the people who was pushing this idea that because we voted to leave the EU, that meant we had to go for this hard, economically damaging version of Brexit that we have now was Iain Dale. And I tried my best to push back on that. Quick warning, this is going to make you lose your shit because this is before Brexit actually happened, when this could have all been prevented.
The relationship between the EU and Norway, which is a non-EU country, can be defined largely as regulatory cooperation, yes?
Correct.
Yeah. So does regulatory cooperation mean that it's inside the European Union?
Yes.
Well,
Because all of those regulations are created by the European Union. What part of that is difficult to understand?
I can create a cake. I'm not that cake.
Do you understand why my brain just broke just then? It's because Norway is not in the EU. That is a matter of uncontestable fact. It's not an EU country. There are 27 countries in the EU. Norway is not one of them. But because Norway has a relationship with the EU that Brexiteers like Iain Dale did not want, in order to keep up the lie that leaving the EU had to mean leaving the single market as well, Iain Dale, one of the most high-profile news politics hosts in the country, had to then say, no, but Norway is in the EU. And this is why Brexit is the biggest con in UK history, because they sold us Brexit on the basis of
absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market.
Nigel Farage even promoted Norway as an example of a country we should follow, even though Norway is in the EU single market.
That everybody from David Cameron to half this panel say, wouldn't it be terrible if we were like Norway and Switzerland? Really? They're rich, they're happy, they're self-governing.
And yet once they'd won the referendum, people like Iain Dale pushed the idea that we had to go for this economically damaging version of Brexit, and yet now that we're in a cost of living crisis with record levels of poverty, they're now saying, but why aren't people having more kids? Like I said, shitting in my mouth and then telling me that my breath stinks.